The Bible, a book revered for its wisdom and spiritual guidance, also contains stark and unsettling narratives of sexual sins. These stories, often overlooked or glossed over, serve as cautionary tales, illustrating the devastating consequences of lust, immorality, and the violation of sacred boundaries. These aren't tales for the faint of heart, and some may find the content disturbing. Consider carefully before proceeding. We delve into accounts that explore the depths of human depravity, the corruption of societal norms, and the enduring impact of these transgressions on individuals, families, cities, and even entire nations. One of the most infamous examples is the story of Sodom, a city that had become synonymous with wickedness. The inhabitants of Sodom didn't simply disregard God's laws. They openly mocked and defied them. Perverted sexual practices were rampant, challenging the divinely ordained standards for the sanctity of the body and the sanctity of relationships. It wasn't just about consenting adults. It was about unchecked lust that consumed the very fabric of their society. Imagine a place where morality had completely eroded, where basic human decency was replaced by an insatiable appetite for gratification. It was a place where men preyed upon the vulnerable, where families were torn apart by infidelity and perversion, and where the cries of the oppressed were ignored. The scale of Sodom's wickedness reached such a point that it caught the attention of the divine. God himself declared, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me." This wasn't a casual observation. It was a declaration of intent, a promise to investigate the depths of their depravity and to hold them accountable. The episode involving the angel's visit to Lot's house serves as a chilling illustration of the prevailing atmosphere in Sodom. As twilight descended upon the city, two angelic beings arrived, disguised as ordinary travelers. Lot, a righteous man who resided in Sodom, recognizing their vulnerability, extended his hospitality and urged them to spend the night in his home. He pleaded with them, "Please, turn aside into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." Lot understood the dangers that lurked in the streets of Sodom, especially after dark. His apprehension was well-founded. Before long, Sodom revealed its true, sinister face. While Lot and the angels were inside his home, a mob of men from all parts of the city, young and old, surrounded the house. They pounded on the door with relentless force, their voices filled with malice and lust. "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" they demanded. "Bring them out to us so we can have sex with them." Think about the audacity of this demand, a collective cry for sexual assault, a brazen display of depravity without shame or boundaries. Lust had completely blinded these individuals, driving them to the brink of madness. They were willing to destroy anything and anyone in their path to satisfy their perverse desires. Lot, desperate to protect his guests, stepped outside to reason with the mob. "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing," he pleaded. But his words fell on deaf ears. The crowd mocked him, becoming even more violent and threatening. They accused him of being a foreigner who dared to judge them. Seeing that the situation was spiraling out of control, the angels intervened. They pulled Lot back inside the house, shut the door, and struck the men outside with blindness. The divine intervention was a clear sign that the wickedness of Sodom had reached its breaking point. The sins of Sodom had surpassed all limits, demonstrating that the city was beyond redemption. Before dawn, the angels instructed Lot and his family to flee. They were given a stark warning: "Flee for your lives. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will be swept away." God was about to unleash his judgment upon Sodom, and there would be no escape for those who remained. As the sun began to rise, Fire and sulfur rained down from the heavens, consuming everything in its path. There was no escape for those who had surrendered themselves to immorality and sin. Sodom and Gomorrah were reduced to ashes, a perpetual reminder that God does not tolerate wickedness. Even Lot's wife, in a moment of disobedience, looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. But the story of Sodom is just one example of the dark side of human behavior revealed in the Bible. The following stories are even more disturbing. Beyond the fiery destruction of Sodom, the Bible unveils other accounts of moral decay and sexual transgression, each with its own unique horror. We turn our attention now to stories that are even more deeply unsettling, tales that test the boundaries of human comprehension and challenge our understanding of the consequences of sin. Consider, for example, the chilling account of a brother who used deception and manipulation to violate his own sister. This is not a story of strangers, but of familial betrayal, a crime committed within the supposed safety of the home. The violation of trust and the shattering of innocence are at the heart of this narrative, highlighting the devastating impact of unchecked lust and the abuse of power. Or consider the tragic tale of an entire nation seduced by foreign women who lured them into rituals of lust and idolatry. This is not just a story of individual failings, but of widespread societal corruption, a spiritual and moral collapse that led to devastating consequences. The blurring of religious boundaries and the abandonment of God's commandments are central to this narrative, demonstrating the dangers of cultural assimilation and the seductive power of false gods. Then there is the story of a night of terror in Gibeah, a town within Israel where lust and sexual violence led to a brutal civil war that nearly wiped out an entire tribe. This narrative is so disturbing that it continues to provoke questions and debate about the limits of human depravity and the nature of justice. Let us turn our attention to this event in Gibeah, exploring the darkness that enveloped this Israelite community and the catastrophic repercussions of their actions. It was a seemingly ordinary night in Gibeah, a city nestled within the territory allotted to the tribe of Benjamin. However, what began as an unremarkable day would soon transform into a harrowing nightmare, an event so tragic that it would be etched in the memories of generations to come. A Levite, a man dedicated to serving God, was traveling with his concubine. Long journeys were fraught with danger, especially at night when bandits and violent men lurked in the shadows. As darkness fell, the Levite and his concubine arrived in Gibeah, believing that as a city inhabited by Israelites, they would find hospitality and safety. However, they soon discovered that Gibeah was far different from what they had expected. The Levite and his concubine sat in the town square, waiting for someone to invite them to spend the night, as was customary among the people of Israel. But no one came. No one offered them shelter or assistance. This unusual behavior spoke volumes about the moral decay that had taken root in Gibeah. Hospitality was a hallmark of God's people, but in this city, the hearts of the people had hardened. They ignored the needs of the travelers, revealing the decline of their community. Finally, an elderly man, himself a foreigner, noticed the Levite and his concubine in the square. Sensing that something was amiss, he approached them and said,
"Come, stay at my house. Don't spend the night in the square."
There was a sense of urgency in his voice, as if he wanted to protect them from something terrible. The Levite accepted the invitation, and they went to the old man's house, thinking they would be safe. But the night was just beginning. While the Levite, his concubine, and their host were inside the house, unsettling sounds began to echo from outside. Initially, it was just the sound of footsteps, then whispers, which soon escalated into shouts and violent knocking on the door. Men from all parts of Gibeah, young and old, surrounded the house. They were driven by a sinister purpose. "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him," they yelled. It was an abominable demand, a demonstration of the utter depravity of the city. The mob was not just motivated by lust, it was also an expression of violence and power, an attempt to dominate and humiliate the old man. Horrified, the old man went outside to try to appease the crowd. "No, my friends, don't be so vile. This man is my guest. Don't do such a thing." But his words were ignored. The crowd mocked him, becoming even more aggressive. In a desperate attempt to appease the mob, the old man made an unthinkable decision. He offered his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine to satisfy their desires. "Here are my daughter, who is a virgin, and his concubine. I'll bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But to this man, do not do such a shameful thing." It was a horrifying proposal, but the crowd was beyond reason. It was at that moment that the Levite, in an act of cowardice and self-preservation, pushed his concubine outside to the mercy of the mob. The concubine, thrust into the midst of the depraved mob, was subjected to unspeakable brutality throughout the night. Her cries of pain and despair echoed through the city, yet no one came to her rescue. The men of Gibeah, consumed by their lust and unchecked power, showed no mercy. They took turns violating her, each one seeking to satisfy their perverse desires without regard for her suffering. The night stretched on, an unending torment for the helpless woman. When morning finally arrived, the mob, their lust spent, left her lying at the doorstep of the old man's house. She barely had the strength to move, her body battered and unrecognizable. As dawn broke, the Levite opened the door and found his concubine sprawled on the ground, her hands reaching towards the door as if she had tried to crawl back inside. "Get up," he said to her, "let's go." But she did not respond. The brutality of the night had extinguished her life, leaving her broken and lifeless. Overwhelmed by rage and grief, the Levite made a decision that would shock the entire nation of Israel. He carried the body of his concubine back home, and in a gruesome and symbolic act, he cut her into 12 pieces. Each piece was then sent to a different tribe of Israel, accompanied by a message: "Consider what has happened in Gibeah, judge for yourselves." The horrific act was a call to action, an appeal for justice, and a condemnation of the wickedness that had corrupted Gibeah. The Levite's intention was to provoke the tribes of Israel to unite and punish the perpetrators of this heinous crime. When the leaders of the tribes received the pieces of the concubine's body, they were horrified. It was a clear message. Gibeah had committed an unspeakable act, and Israel could not stand idly by. The entire nation of Israel gathered at Mizpah to decide what to do. The tribes demanded that the men of Gibeah be handed over to them to be judged and punished. But the tribe of Benjamin, to which Gibeah belonged, refused. Instead, they chose to protect the guilty, even knowing the abominable act they had committed. This refusal led to a devastating civil war. The other tribes of Israel turned against Benjamin, and the battle was bloody and fierce. In the end, the tribe of Benjamin was nearly exterminated, with only 600 men surviving by fleeing into the wilderness. The story of Gibeah ended in destruction and mourning, a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked lust, violence, and the failure of a community to uphold justice. The events in Gibeah left an indelible mark on the history of Israel, a cautionary tale about the dangers of moral decay and the importance of holding individuals accountable for their actions. However, sexual sins did not end there. What happens when two desperate daughters decide to intoxicate their own father, leading to the most absurd act ever recorded in the Bible? Following the catastrophic destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the world of Lot and his daughters had been irrevocably altered. They had narrowly escaped the divine wrath, but everything they once knew was gone. The memory of the burning cities and the pungent smell of sulfur lingered in their minds, a constant reminder of the devastation they had witnessed. As Lot fled to the mountains, following the instructions of the angels, they sought refuge in a cave. Isolated and without a community, their future was uncertain, overshadowed by a cloud of despair. Lot, who had once prospered in the plains of Sodom, now lived as a refugee, uncertain of what lay ahead. His daughters, raised in the corrupt environment of Sodom, had not only lost their home, but also their sense of right and wrong. The future seemed bleak, impossible. They believed that there were no other men left in the world, and that their lineage would end there, forgotten in the wilderness. The older daughter, driven by desperation, said to her younger sister, "Our father is old, and there is no man on earth to sleep with us, as is the custom of all the world. Let's get our father to drink wine and then sleep with him, so we can preserve our family." Line. It was a shocking plan, a mixture of ignorance, fear, and the distorted morality they had inherited from Sodom. They decided to act on their own, without consulting God or seeking his guidance. That very night, the sisters put their plan into action. The older daughter offered Lot wine until he was completely intoxicated, unable to comprehend what was happening. Then she lay with him. Lot was completely unaware of what had transpired. The man who had been spared from the destruction of Sodom because he was considered righteous was now unknowingly involved in an act that violated the moral and spiritual laws of God. The next day, the older daughter encouraged the younger sister, saying, "I slept with my father last night. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight, and you go in and sleep with him so we can preserve our family line through our father." With this calculated and perverse plan, they continued to violate their father, exploiting his vulnerability and their own distorted understanding of survival. In this way, both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The children born from this incestuous union would go on to shape the history of Israel in profound ways, albeit in a negative light. The first, Moab, the son of the older daughter, became the ancestor of the Moabites. The second, Ben-Ami, the son of the younger daughter, became the father of the Ammonites. These two peoples, despite sharing a distant connection to Abraham through Lot, grew up in opposition to Israel. Not only did they reject the ways of God, but they became avowed enemies, constantly challenging Israel's sovereignty and spiritual integrity. Moabites and Ammonites were constantly at odds with Israel, bringing idolatry, war, and spiritual corruption into the region. They were a constant source of temptation and conflict, embodying the consequences of the daughter's desperate and sinful act. The story of Lot and his daughters serves as a sobering reminder of the far-reaching consequences of sin, the fragility of moral boundaries in the face of trauma, and the potential for even those who have been spared from destruction to succumb to darkness. Their actions, born out of fear and desperation, had lasting repercussions for generations to come, shaping the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East and presenting a continuous challenge to the people of Israel. From this disturbing tale of familial transgression, we turn our attention to another form of sexual sin, the corruption within the priesthood itself. The priests of Israel held a unique and sacred role, serving as intermediaries between God and the people. They offered sacrifices, maintained the tabernacle, and ensured that the Israelites remained faithful to God's laws. But what happens when the very individuals entrusted with upholding moral and spiritual standards become corrupted by their own desires? In the time of Eli, the high priest of Israel, something truly terrible was happening. Eli's own sons, Hophni and Phinehas, had become symbols of corruption and immorality, profaning the tabernacle with their sexual sins. They were not merely individuals who had strayed from the path of righteousness. They were actively undermining the very foundation of Israel's relationship with God. Hophni and Phinehas were the sons of Eli, the high priest. From a young age, They had been instructed in the law of God and had direct access to the sacred service. They should have been examples of purity and obedience, setting a standard for the rest of the nation. But instead, they became the opposite, arrogant, greedy, and immoral. In 1 Samuel 2:12, the Bible describes them in stark and impactful terms. Now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. This was not simply a matter of ignorance. It was a deliberate rejection of God's authority and a disregard for His commandments. They not only disrespected the rules of the priesthood, but also used their position to enrich themselves. One of their most abhorrent practices was stealing from the offerings brought to the tabernacle. The law stipulated that a portion of the offerings was to be given to the priests for their sustenance, while the remainder was to be consecrated to God. However, Hophni and Phinehas disregarded this division, sending their servants to forcibly take the best portions of the sacrificed meat. Even before the fat was burned on the altar, people protested, perplexed and outraged. "Let the fat be burned first, as the law requires," they pleaded. But the servants of the priests, acting under the orders of Hophni and Phinehas, would respond, "No, hand it over now. If not, we'll take it by force." This act was not merely material theft, it was spiritual robbery. They were desecrating the sacred offerings and showing contempt for God Himself. It was a blatant display of their disregard for the sanctity of the tabernacle and the holiness of their office. But the stealing was just the beginning. What truly provoked God's wrath was the way Hophni and Phinehas treated the women who served at the entrance to the tabernacle. These women were devout volunteers, dedicated to the Lord, who assisted with the sacred services. But in the eyes of these two corrupt priests, they were not seen as servants of God, but as objects of pleasure. Hophni and Phinehas seduced, manipulated, and in some cases even forced these women to submit to their desires. They exploited their position of power to satisfy their lust, transforming the tabernacle, the holiest place in Israel, into a site of scandal and degradation. The very place where people came to seek God had become a den of iniquity, a place where sin was flaunted openly. Their actions had a devastating impact on the faith and reverence of the people. The example set by these priests was eroding the moral fabric of Israel, leading many to question the integrity of the priesthood and the holiness of God's sanctuary. The corruption at the heart of the religious establishment was poisoning the spiritual wellspring of the nation. Eli, the father of Hophni and Phinehas, was aware of their transgressions. The people came to him to complain about the abuses, and Eli attempted to rebuke them with words. "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about your wicked deeds. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear spreading among the Lord's people." But his words had no effect. Hophni and Phinehas completely ignored their father's warnings. Eli, instead of taking drastic action, such as removing them from the priesthood or seeking God's guidance, remained passive. He allowed the scandal to continue, prioritizing familial peace over honoring God. His lack of decisive action was a critical failure of leadership that would have dire consequences. God could not ignore what was happening. He sent a man of God to confront Eli and announce the judgment that was to come. "Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel?" asked the prophet. The message was clear. God had entrusted Eli with the responsibility of leading the people, but his negligence in the face of Hophni and Phinehas' sins brought guilt upon his entire lineage. God announced that Eli's priestly line would be cut off. He would not allow the names of Hophni and Phinehas to continue to be associated with the priesthood. The prophet declared that both of them would die on the same day as a sign of God's divine judgment. And that is exactly what happened. During a battle against the Philistines, Hophni and Phinehas were killed, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured. When Eli received the news, he fell from his chair, broke his neck and died, bringing an end to a dark chapter in the history of Israel. The deaths of Eli and his sons served as a stark warning against the dangers of neglecting moral and spiritual responsibilities and the consequences of prioritizing personal comfort over obedience to God. But the stories of sexual sin in the Bible do not end with the corruption of individuals. What happens when the next sin is not committed by a single man or group, but by an entire nation? The people of Israel, during their journey through the desert, fell into temptation and indulged in idolatry and sexual immorality with Moabite women. The result was a sin so grave that it provoked a devastating plague, and only an act of extreme courage managed to stop God's wrath. The people of Israel were encamped in the plains of Moab, on the banks of the Jordan River. It was the final stage of their long journey through the wilderness before they entered the promised land. God had guided them, sustained them with manna, and demonstrated his power in undeniable ways. He had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, parted the Red Sea, and provided for their every need in the barren desert. But even with so many miracles, something terrible happened. Israel fell into the trap of sexual sin and idolatry. It all began with a malicious plan devised by Balak, the king of Moab. Balak had hired Balaam, a prophet, to curse Israel. Balak feared the Israelites and their growing power, and he believed that a curse from a powerful prophet would weaken them and allow him to defeat them in battle. However, God intervened and prevented Balaam from cursing Israel. Every time Balaam tried to utter a curse, God turned it into a blessing. Frustrated, Balak sought another way to weaken God's people. And it was then that temptation arrived in a subtle and devastating manner. The women of Moab knew exactly how to entice the men of Israel. They did not appear threatening or overtly seductive. On the contrary, they approached as friends, with smiles, gentle words, and an apparent willingness to befriend the Israelites. They approached slowly, using their beauty and charm as weapons. "You are so strong," they would say to the Israelite men as they worked in the fields or rested in their camps. "Come to our land. We have feasts, good food, wine, and celebrations that you will never forget." At first it seemed harmless. The men, weary from their long journey through the desert, were easily drawn to the promises of comfort and enjoyment. The invitations became more frequent, and many Israelites began to accept, thinking that there would be no harm in socializing with the Moabites. Upon arriving at the celebrations, the men of Israel found an intoxicating atmosphere. Wine flowed freely. The tables were laden with abundant food, and the music played loudly. But what drew their attention most were the women, who danced provocatively, dressed in clothes that accentuated their sensuality. These parties were not merely social gatherings. They were rituals dedicated to Baal, the principal god of Moab. Baal was worshipped as a god of fertility, and his cult involved acts of sexual immorality as a way to invoke blessings upon the land and the flocks. The Moabite women were skilled in the art of seduction, using their beauty and charm to lure the Israelite men into these idolatrous practices. In the beginning, the men of Israel merely observed, perhaps feeling uncomfortable. But soon, the atmosphere enveloped them. Under the influence of wine and music, their inhibitions began to fade. The women encouraged them, saying, "It's just a dance, a celebration of life. Come, join us." Little by little, they began to participate. What started as a dance quickly turned into something more intimate. The rituals dedicated to Baal Peor were explicitly sexual. The men were encouraged to join the Moabite women in acts of immorality that were considered part of the worship. Each physical relationship was seen as a way to please the god Baal, a living sacrifice to ensure fertility and prosperity. Men who had been taught to follow God's commandments, who knew that the body was a sacred temple, were now lying with pagan women in the name of an idol. It was not just an act of lust, it was an open rejection of the God who had delivered them from Egypt. These men were not only betraying their wives and families, they were betraying the very covenant with the Lord. As more men of Israel became involved, the behavior began to spread throughout the camp. Sexual sin was no longer hidden. It became commonplace. The Moabite women now had a place among the Israelites, walking freely among them, continuing to seduce them. Idolatry also began to gain ground. Small altars to Baal appeared here and there, and sacrifices began to be performed in plain sight of the people. These were not just secret acts, they were openly defiant of God. The chosen people, set apart to be holy, were now so mingled with the Moabites that it was difficult to distinguish who worshipped God and who worshipped Baal. The sacred covenant between Israel and the Lord seemed to be a distant memory. As the men continued to indulge in sin, what began as individual temptation quickly spread like an epidemic. The chosen people who had been separated for God were now prostrate before a foreign idol. The wrath of God was kindled against Israel. He commanded Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." While this was happening, a plague began to spread through the camp. Men and women fell dead, and terror gripped Israel. In the midst of the chaos, something shocking happened. An Israelite man brought a Midianite woman into his tent, right in the sight of everyone, without any shame. While the people mourned and sought God, he openly defied the holiness of the Lord. It was then that Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron and a priest, took drastic action. He seized a spear, entered the tent, and pierced the bodies of both the man and the woman. This act of zeal immediately stopped the plague. God declared that Phinehas had turned away his wrath and promised to make an everlasting covenant with him and his descendants because of his zeal for God's holiness. In all, 24,000 people died because of that sin. The worship of Baal Peor was one of the most serious falls of Israel during their journey through the desert. It was a painful reminder of how lust and idolatry go hand in hand, leading to alienation from God and destruction. But what happens when a brother harbors forbidden desires for his sister? Amnon was not a stranger or an enemy. He was part of the royal household, the firstborn son of King David. But a sick desire for his own sister, Tamar, led him to set a cruel trap. What happened that night irreparably destroyed Tamar and left deep scars on the house of David. The story of King David is one of the most well-known in the Bible. He was called by God, defeated giants, wrote psalms, and became the greatest king of Israel. But like every family, the house of David also faced moments of pain and tragedy, many of them stemming from sin. One of the darkest episodes was what happened between his children, Amnon and Tamar, a tale of lust, abuse, and devastating consequences. Amnon was the eldest son of David, heir to the throne, a young man who had everything. Amnon was the eldest, son of David, heir to the throne, a young man who had everything, but he was consumed by dark desires. Tamar, his half-sister, was a beautiful and pure young woman, admired for her grace and kindness. Amnon began to develop an obsession with Tamar, but it wasn't love, it was lust. He desired her intensely, and the more he thought about her, the more his mind filled with perverse ideas. The Bible says that Amnon became so obsessed with Tamar that he became ill. He knew that he couldn't simply have her because Tamar was a virgin and the king's daughter, protected by laws and customs. But Amnon's desire knew no bounds. It was then that Amnon shared his torment with Jonadab, his cousin and friend. Jonadab, instead of advising him to give up that sinful desire, offered him a wicked plan so that Amnon could get what he wanted. "Pretend that you are sick," Jonadab said. "When your father comes to visit you, ask him to let Tamar prepare food for you and bring it to your room." Amnon followed the plan. He pretended to be seriously ill, and when David came to visit him, he asked, "Please let Tamar come and prepare something for me to eat so that I may feel better." Suspecting nothing, David agreed. Tamar, as a loving sister, went to Amnon's room. She prepared food for him, taking care of every detail with affection. But when she brought the food to his room, Amnon put his evil plan into action. "Have everyone leave here," he ordered. When they were alone, Amnon grabbed Tamar. She desperately tried to resist, begging, "No, my brother, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this shameful thing. Think of the shame this would bring on me and on you." But Amnon did not listen. Overcome by lust, he raped her, destroying her purity and honor. After committing his act, Amnon's feelings for Tamar changed drastically. The Bible says that he began to hate her more than he had desired her. "Get up and get out," he said to her with contempt. Tamar, now emotionally shattered, pleaded, "Don't send me away. This wrong is greater than the other you have done to me." But Amnon called his servants and ordered them to throw her out. She was thrown out, humiliated and ashamed. Tamar tore her robes, put ashes on her head, and went to the house of her brother Absalom. He took her in, but he also began to plan his revenge against Amnon. When King David heard what had happened, he was furious. But to the surprise of many, he took no action against Amnon, perhaps because he was his firstborn and heir, or perhaps because of his own guilt over past sins. David remained silent. Absalom, on the other hand, did not forget. He waited 2 years, and then during a feast, he had Amnon killed, avenging his sister Tamar. This act of sexual violence destroyed the unity of David's house. Tamar never fully recovered from the shame. Amnon lost his life, and Absalom, after killing his brother, came into conflict with his father David, starting a rebellion that nearly destroyed the kingdom. This story shows how sexual sin not only affects those involved, but spreads, causing pain and destruction in families and communities. These biblical narratives serve as stark warnings about the destructive power of unchecked lust, the importance of upholding moral boundaries, and the far-reaching consequences of sin. They remind us that even those in positions of power and influence are not immune to temptation, and that the choices we make have a profound impact on ourselves, our families, and our communities. They are stories that should make us think, discuss, and understand the consequences of our actions.